go into the furnace and are burnt into fertilizer rather than being burnt into the atmosphere in a fire. So the farmers can then reclaim, reuse, and sell on effectively their fertilizer. He reckons with scale that he can reduce 1 billion tons of CO2. Get my stats right. So
Just 3 minutes ago, Buckingham Palace released a statement that has left the entire world in absolute shock. What Princess Catherine and Prince William just confirmed about Prince Louis is beyond heartbreaking. The words they used weren't the usual royal talk. They were the desperate plea of two parents watching their child suffer. And what they're still hiding is even more terrifying.
So my passion and the work of the Centre for Early Childhood stems from one essential truth: that the love we feel in our earliest years fundamentally shapes who we become and how we thrive as adults. Love is the first and most essential bond.
Before we reveal what really happened behind those palace walls, you need to hear this, because what you're about to discover will shatter everything you thought you knew about the royal family. The message itself was remarkably short, under 100 words, but every single word seemed to carry an enormous weight. This wasn't an announcement about succession planning or a minor royal scandal. This was about a child, specifically Prince Louis, and the way Prince William and Princess Catherine chose to address the situation told observers everything they needed to know before the full meaning had even sunk in. What made this announcement so unusual was the timing. Royal watchers and historians have noted that when palace announcements come at odd times, outside the normal schedule of royal communications, it typically signals that something significant has happened behind the scenes. The 3 minutes past the hour timing wasn't a coincidence. It suggested that decisions had been made quickly, that normal protocols had been bypassed, and that whatever was happening couldn't wait for the usual careful planning that goes into royal statements. But the timing wasn't even the most striking aspect of this announcement. What truly shocked people across Britain and around the world was who delivered the message. For the first time in recent memory, the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge chose to issue the statement themselves. There was no spokesperson reading from prepared remarks, no official representative acting as an intermediary. William and Catherine spoke directly to the public, not as members of the royal institution, but as parents dealing with something profoundly personal. This departure from protocol was significant in ways that many people outside royal circles might not immediately understand. The monarchy has spent centuries building layers of separation between the personal lives of royals and their public duties. There are entire departments dedicated to managing communications, teams of people whose job it is to craft messages that maintain the dignity and distance traditionally associated with the crown. For William and Catherine to bypass all of that and speak directly represented a seismic shift in how the modern monarchy handles crisis. The tone of their message was carefully measured but unmistakably somber. Experts who have studied royal communications for decades pointed out that there was no panic in the language used, but there was also no hope. Instead, the statement carried what many described as a heavy sense of acceptance. Phrases like deeply, personal, grateful for understanding, and ongoing support appeared throughout the text, painting a picture that was far bleaker than what the words explicitly stated. The British public, along with royal watchers internationally, has become quite skilled at reading between the lines of official palace statements. The monarchy has its own coded language, a way of communicating difficult truths without stating them directly. When people began analysing this particular statement, they recognised immediately that something was terribly wrong with Prince Louis. More than that, they understood that William and Catherine weren't just asking for privacy or space. They were pleading for understanding in a way that suggested the situation was far more serious than a temporary setback. Within minutes of the statement's release, the media landscape transformed completely. News anchors found themselves stumbling over their prepared scripts, trying to process what they were reading in real time. Royal correspondents, many of whom had covered the monarchy for decades and had witnessed countless ceremonial events and minor scandals, appeared visibly shaken on camera. Several admitted during live broadcasts that they had never seen anything quite like this in their entire careers. Social media platforms exploded with reactions. Twitter became a flood of concerned messages, questions, and speculation. Telegram groups dedicated to royal news lit up with activity. The shockwaves didn't stop at Britain's borders. The news spread rapidly across Europe, reaching Australia, Canada, and the United States within minutes. What started as a simple palace statement had become a global moment of collective concern. This wasn't just another news story about the royals. It felt like something fundamental had ruptured in the carefully maintained facade of the royal household. For years, the public had watched William and Catherine raise their 3 children with what appeared to be a perfect balance of royal duty and normal family life. They had been praised for giving their children experiences outside palace walls, for choosing schools that other British families used, for appearing at events as a close-knit, happy family. The image had been one of modern royalty done right. Now that image was cracking, and people didn't know what to make of it. Veteran commentators began drawing comparisons to other dark moments in royal history. Some recalled the announcement of Princess Diana's death, the way time seemed to stop and disbelief settled over the nation. Others thought of Queen Elizabeth's passing, a moment when the end of an era became suddenly real. But this situation felt distinctly different. This wasn't about losing a figurehead or the passing of a long life well lived. This was about a young boy, a child whose cheerful expressions at royal events had brought joy to millions, now at the center of something heartbreaking. What haunted so many people wasn't just the sadness of the situation. It was the sense of finality in the language used. The words chosen weren't the kind typically reserved for temporary health scares or minor setbacks. They didn't sound like the careful optimism usually present in statements about royal family members facing difficulties. Instead, they sounded conclusive, almost irreversible. The statement seemed to be preparing people for something permanent rather than reassuring them about a situation that would improve with time. At that moment, Britain didn't just pause to process the news. The nation began to grieve, even though most people didn't fully understand what had happened to Prince Louis. They grieved because they feared they already knew, or at least suspected that whatever was happening was serious enough to break through centuries of royal reserve and force 2 parents to speak directly to the world about their child's suffering. While the public focused intensely on what William and Catherine had said, people inside the palace understood that the real gravity of the situation lay in what hadn't been said. Royal statements are carefully designed to calm public anxiety, to provide just enough information to satisfy curiosity while maintaining appropriate boundaries. This statement did the opposite. It unsettled people. Every sentence felt weighted down by deliberate omission. Communication experts and royal analysts began noticing specific things about the language used. They pointed out the pauses in phrasing, the unusually soft word choices, and most significantly, the conspicuous absence of any reassurances. There were no phrases like expected to make a full recovery or responding well to treatment. There was no timeline offered, no suggestion of when things might return to normal. The message existed in a state of suspended emotion, appearing calm on the surface, but deeply unnerving underneath. This wasn't the language of optimism or even cautious hope. This was the language of preparation, of parents and an institution trying to ready the public for something they weren't quite ready to say out loud. And within minutes of the statement's release, seasoned royal observers began asking the most frightening question of all. What exactly were William and Catherine still holding back? What truth was too difficult to share even in this moment of unprecedented openness? In the hours and days following the initial statement, newsrooms across Britain and around the world didn't simply report what had been said. They began a careful process of dissection, analysing not just the content of the message, but the way it had been delivered. The tone, which observers universally described as muted and mournful, turned out to be more revealing than the actual words on the page. What became increasingly apparent was what wasn't included in the statement. There were no polished phrases offering reassurance to a worried public. No timelines were provided, no suggestions of when Prince Louis might return to normal activities. There were no comforting statements like expected to make a full recovery or currently resting and responding well to treatment. These are the kinds of phrases that typically appear in statements about royal family members facing health challenges, designed to calm public anxiety while maintaining appropriate privacy. Instead, the message seemed to hover in an uncomfortable middle ground, outwardly calm but deeply troubling beneath the surface. According to sources familiar with the palace's internal operations, the statement had been the product of hours of painful deliberation. Royal aides reportedly spent significant time redrafting the message, pausing between sentences, acutely aware that every word would be analysed and that each phrase carried implications extending far beyond its literal meaning. These weren't people simply composing a press release according to established protocols. They were preparing the public for something that couldn't be controlled or managed in the usual way. The careful omission of specific medical terminology, the absence of doctors' names, and the decision not to even use the phrase health issue spoke volumes to those trained in reading royal communications. This was less a statement of clarity and more an acknowledgement that the family was facing something they could no longer contain through traditional means. Perhaps most telling was what the statement didn't project into the future. There was no mention of when Prince Louis might be seen again at public events, no hint about a return to school activities or engagements, no reference to future occasions where he might appear alongside his siblings, Prince George and Princess Charlotte. The complete absence of any forward-looking language made it clear to observers that this wasn't simply a delay in the normal course of royal life. This was something more fundamental, a derailment that nobody seemed quite prepared to name explicitly. Behind closed doors, according to multiple sources, whispers had been growing louder that this crisis had been developing for far longer than anyone outside the immediate family had realized. Journalists who had covered the royal family for years began the difficult work of revisiting recent footage and photographs of Prince Louis. Images and video clips that had once seemed perfectly normal now took on new significance under this changed context. Smiles that had appeared playful and genuine now looked forced to some observers. Moments that had been dismissed as typical childhood behavior or minor mischief were being reinterpreted as potential signs of deeper struggles. Even the body language between William, Catherine, and Louis in past public appearances began to be analysed with fresh eyes. People started asking whether the signs had been there all along, visible but unrecognised until this moment of crisis forced everyone to look more carefully. The public wasn't the only group caught off guard by the severity of the situation. Reports emerged that some palace staff members had learned about the full scope of what was happening only hours before the statement was released to the world. Their shock and grief, according to those who witnessed it, was genuine and raw rather than performative. This wasn't just about a child in the royal family experiencing distress. It represented the collapse of a carefully maintained belief that the youngest members of the monarchy, protected by layers of security and insulated by routine, were somehow immune to the struggles that affect ordinary families. Perhaps the most devastating realization for many was the growing understanding that this situation wasn't temporary. This wasn't a brief interruption in royal duties that would resolve itself with time and appropriate care. The tone and content of the statement, combined with the complete absence of any suggestion of recovery or return, pointed towards something more permanent. It wasn't an announcement of loss, but it felt like a preparation for fundamental change, a quiet beginning of something that would alter Prince Louis's relationship with public life in ways that might never be reversed. The royal facade, so carefully constructed and maintained over generations, had cracked. Behind it stood two parents who were desperately trying to manage an impossible situation, attempting to delay the full exposure of pain they could no longer contain within the private sphere of their family life. Then Prince William did something that broke centuries of royal precedent. He spoke not from a position of institutional authority, but from a place of profound personal pain. There was no formal script, no carefully staged setting with podium and flags, no protective shield of ceremonial formality. When William next addressed the situation, he did so not as a future king, but as a father who was, in the eyes of many observers, unraveling in real time. His voice, according to those who heard him speak, faltered noticeably. His usual composure, the product of years of training in public speaking and royal duty, wavered in ways that shocked people who had watched him handle difficult situations with apparent ease. In that moment, the monarchy's most carefully guarded illusion collapsed completely. This was raw grief, fear, and helplessness laid bare for the world to witness, without the usual filters that protect royals from appearing too human, too vulnerable. The moment William stepped forward to speak more personally about the situation, it became immediately clear that something fundamental had changed in how he understood his role. This wasn't a prepared speech designed by communications experts. It was, in many ways, a confession. The carefully curated image of the poised, steady heir to the throne disappeared, replaced by a man visibly struggling to contain emotions that had clearly been building beneath the surface for some time. William didn't open with the usual, pleasantries that typically begin royal addresses. He didn't thank the press for their attention or express gratitude to the public for their concern. Instead, he began with a statement that brought an entire nation to a standstill. He said simply and directly, "I should have seen it sooner." Those 6 words, more than any lengthy explanation could have done, dismantled decades of carefully maintained royal distance. In that brief sentence, William positioned himself not as someone with power and resources at his disposal, but as someone who had failed at the most basic level of parenthood. He went on to describe months of quiet tension within the palace, explaining how Louis had gradually grown quieter and more withdrawn. The family had initially dismissed these changes as a normal phase of childhood development, the kind of temporary shift that many children experience. William admitted that palace life itself, with all its rituals, obligations, and structured routines, had somehow masked what was truly happening in their home. The very systems designed to support and protect the royal family had, in this case, made it easier to overlook the signals that something was wrong. With each passing day, William explained, the signs had become easier to miss rather than harder to ignore, until the situation had reached a point where it could no longer be denied. Beneath the candor was a deeper layer of truth that revealed the crushing weight of guilt William was carrying. He spoke about nights spent pacing the corridors of their residence, wrestling with the question of how he, of all people, hadn't known what was happening. How could someone so attuned to national and international affairs, someone trained to read situations and people, be so blind to the pain existing in his own home? William recalled specific moments that now haunted him. Times when Louis had asked to skip family engagements, occasions when his laughter seemed rehearsed rather than genuine. Instances when his eyes, once so full of natural childhood wonder, looked hollow and distant. And through all of this, William admitted with obvious pain, he had done nothing because he hadn't wanted to believe what he was seeing. One particular memory shattered William's composure entirely during his remarks. He paused, clearly trying to gather himself, and then shared something Louis had once asked him. The question was simple but devastating. "Do I have to smile when I don't feel it?" William's voice broke as he repeated these words. It wasn't a question born of rebellion or teenage angst. It was a plea, a cry from a child who felt like he was drowning in an ocean of unspoken expectations, struggling to maintain appearances when his internal reality was completely different. That moment, William confessed, was when he finally saw his son clearly, without the filters of royal duty and public image. And the recognition of what had been happening nearly destroyed him as a father. He didn't hold back in describing the toll this situation had taken on every aspect of their family life. His marriage to Catherine had been strained by the weight of worry and the challenge of navigating this crisis while maintaining public duties. His role as a father to all 3 children had become complicated in ways he hadn't anticipated. The balance within their household had fundamentally shifted. Prince George, the eldest, had grown noticeably more serious, taking on a gravity that seemed beyond his years. Princess Charlotte had begun watching Louis with eyes that mirrored their mother's quiet, constant worry. The whole family dynamic had tilted off its axis, with everyone affected by Louis's struggle, even as they tried to maintain some sense of normalcy. While William spoke publicly about the emotional toll on their family, another crisis was quietly developing behind closed doors. Princess Charlotte, who had always been close to her younger brother, was experiencing her own silent breakdown. She was never meant to carry the weight of what was happening to Louis, but as he retreated further inward, Charlotte found herself stepping into an emotional void that no child should have to fill. In the early stages of Louis's struggles, Charlotte had remained remarkably steady. She was the sibling who held his hand during public events, the one who whispered reassurances to him when cameras turned away, the one who positioned herself slightly closer to him than might have seemed necessary. Many observers at the time had simply interpreted this as a sweet example of sibling closeness, the kind of protective behavior that older sisters sometimes display. But it was far more than that. Charlotte, despite her young age, had begun carrying a burden that should never fall on a child. She was absorbing her brother's unspoken suffering, becoming his translator in situations where he couldn't express himself, his shadow at events where he felt overwhelmed, and his shield against pressures she didn't fully understand but instinctively recognized as harmful. Nobody had asked her to take on this role, and most people around her hadn't even realized she was doing it. It took weeks after William's public confession for the signs of Charlotte's own internal collapse to finally surface in ways that couldn't be ignored. Catherine later recounted a moment that broke through her own preoccupation with Louis and made her realize how far the damage had spread. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon at home, the kind of peaceful family time that should have been ordinary and restful. Charlotte suddenly refused to speak, not out of defiance or anger, but from what could only be described as complete emotional exhaustion. She curled into herself, her eyes wide but distant, present physically but absent in every other way. When Catherine gently asked what was wrong, Charlotte responded with a whisper that no parent ever forgets or stops hearing. She said simply and heartbreakingly, "I didn't want you to worry more." That single sentence pierced deeper than any headline or public criticism ever could. It confirmed Catherine's worst fear, that the children were no longer just being affected by the crisis surrounding Louis. They had begun actively managing it, trying to protect their parents from additional pain, even as they suffered themselves. The roles within the family had reversed in the most troubling way possible. The children, who should have been protected and cared for, had instead become the ones doing the shielding. Louis, by this point in the crisis, had almost completely withdrawn from normal routines and activities. He no longer asked about his school friends or expressed interest in seeing them. He stopped begging to stay up late or negotiating for extra time before bed. He no longer laughed at the kinds of jokes and silly moments that usually delight children his age. The spark that had made him uniquely himself was fading, slowly but unmistakably. Catherine watched as Charlotte tried every single day to bring that spark back. She would suggest games they used to play together, sing songs she knew Louis had once enjoyed, or simply sit beside him in quiet company. But nothing seemed to work. The light in Louis wasn't just dimmed, it seemed to be going out entirely. And as Charlotte's efforts continued to fail, she too began slipping into a darker place emotionally. Inside the palace, where duty and protocol often take precedence over personal feeling, nobody had truly grasped what this prolonged silence was doing to the family unit. There were no loud arguments or visible chaos that might have prompted intervention. Instead, there was a slow suffocation of normal emotional expression. Charlotte's collapse, when it finally became impossible to ignore, was the loudest cry for help the family had received. And it came not through tantrums or tears, but through an eerie, troubling stillness. That was the moment Catherine fully realized the extent of what they had missed. They hadn't just failed to recognize the depth of Louis's pain early enough. They had also failed to see how that pain was echoing through every corner of their home, affecting every member of their family in different but equally serious ways. The realization shattered any remaining illusion that the crisis could be managed quietly, that it could be contained within the boundaries of concern for a single child. The suffering had spread like a quiet tide, gradually pulling at the bonds between siblings, straining the relationship between parents, and even affecting the entire structure and routine of their royal duties. The silence that had seemed like the safest approach, the most dignified way to handle private struggles, had actually been their enemy all along. And now that enemy could no longer be tolerated or sustained. Then came the morning that confirmed the crisis had reached an absolute breaking point. It should have been an ordinary day, the kind that fills the calendar of any royal family with school, minor engagements, and routine activities. But Prince Louis never arrived where he was supposed to be. There was no school attendance, no public appearances, no explanations offered to those outside the immediate family circle. Behind the scenes, a decision had been made that was so drastic it would permanently alter the course of Louis's childhood. The monarchy had quietly removed its youngest visible member from public life entirely, and the reasons behind this unprecedented move were far more serious than anyone outside the palace walls fully realized at the time. The silence surrounding his sudden absence was deafening in its completeness. For a child whose occasional waves at crowds and cheeky smiles had captivated millions of people, the abrupt disappearance was impossible not to notice. Parents at Louis's school received brief, carefully worded communications. His classmates were told he would be learning from home for the foreseeable future with no specific timeline provided. The media, showing unusual restraint, largely respected the blackout of information, though not without growing suspicion that something significant had occurred. Something had fundamentally shifted in the House of Wales, and whatever it was had shaken the family to its very core. Sources close to the family would later speak, always carefully and without identifying themselves, about a specific incident that occurred during a school day. This incident reportedly became the final breaking point that led to Louis's complete withdrawal from public and even semi-public life. While details remain intentionally vague out of respect for the child's privacy, these sources hinted at a triggering interaction or situation that left Louis emotionally overwhelmed to the point where he simply could not re-engage with his surroundings. Importantly, this wasn't a physical altercation or a disciplinary matter. It was purely emotional in nature. Something inside Louis cracked during this incident, and in that instant, Catherine knew with absolute certainty that the outside world, even in its most controlled and protected forms, was no longer safe for her son. Not physically perhaps, but emotionally, mentally, and spiritually, the constant exposure was causing genuine harm that could no longer be justified or managed. Within hours of this incident, the family made the decision to retreat completely. A series of emergency meetings followed, involving William, Catherine, and trusted advisors who understood the gravity of what was being proposed. William and Catherine, who had been so devoted to the principle of raising their children with as much normalcy as possible, now faced an impossible reality. The tradition and expectation of royal visibility, the pressure to be seen, to wave, to smile, to behave like perfectly polished royal children at all times, had become poisonous to their youngest son, and it had to stop immediately. The decision they made was one that no member of the modern royal family had made in living memory. They chose to fully remove a young prince from public view, not because of illness in the traditional sense, not because of scandal or misbehavior, and not because of relocation to another residence or country. There would be no explanation of a tour abroad, no mention of an extended summer at Balmoral, no soft excuse that might satisfy public curiosity. There would simply be absence, complete and unexplained. William and Catherine made the deliberate choice not to announce this withdrawal formally. There would be no farewell appearance, no staged photographs to mark Louis's departure from public life, no official statement explaining the decision in detail. Instead, they chose something the royal family rarely embraces as a strategy: silence as a form of protection. They would let people wonder and speculate rather than expose their son to further scrutiny by explaining exactly why he needed to disappear. Behind the scenes, however, the emotional weight of this choice was almost unbearable for William and Catherine. What made it even harder was Louis's reaction, or rather his lack of one. He didn't fight the decision. He didn't resist or argue or express any desire to continue with his previous life. But he also didn't ask why this was happening or what it meant for his future. And that absence of response, that quiet resignation, was what truly broke Catherine's heart. His acceptance felt robotic, automatic, as though he had already disconnected from the world around him. The child who had once brought light and energy to every room he entered had become someone careful, guarded, almost completely detached from his own life. Experts who were quietly brought in to assess the emotional toll and provide guidance warned of potentially serious long-term impacts, particularly if the royal expectations and pressures continued to linger even in private after the public gaze had been removed. What haunted William and Catherine most during this period wasn't simply that they had failed to recognize the warning signs earlier. It was a more fundamental fear that every effort they had made to raise their children in a balanced, relatively normal environment had somehow backfired in the worst possible way. Even their version of normal, their careful attempts to blend royal duty with ordinary childhood experiences, was still fundamentally rooted in protocol, legacy, and the inescapable weight of public duty. As the family retreated inward and struggled to find a path forward, an unexpected figure stepped into the situation with decisive action. Princess Anne, known throughout her life for her pragmatic approach and no-nonsense attitude, recognized patterns in what was happening to Louis that others had missed or chosen to ignore. She had seen this kind of pressure before, witnessed its effects on other members of the family, and she had no intention of standing by while history repeated itself. While palace advisors hesitated and administrative systems stalled in bureaucratic discussions, Princess Anne acted. There were no press releases, no requests for permission from senior officials, just pure instinct, born from decades of understanding how the institution could both protect and damage the people within it. She recognized the pressure, the silence, and the potential for lasting harm. What she offered Prince Louis wasn't traditional treatment wrapped in royal protocol, but something far more radical within the context of the monarchy: genuine normality. The palace had slipped into a kind of paralysis during this crisis. Bureaucrats spent their time debating how the situation would look to the public. Advisors tiptoed around language and phrasing, worried about setting precedents that might complicate future situations. But amidst all of this careful deliberation, nobody was asking the only question that truly mattered: what would actually help the child at the center of all this concern? While others scrambled to manage the crisis from a communications perspective, Princess Anne picked up the phone and demanded to speak with William directly. She approached him not as a senior member of the royal family, not as someone concerned with institutional protocols, but as a sister who had witnessed too much of the monarchy's emotional cost over the years. She had buried too many regrets about times when she might have spoken up, but didn't, and she wasn't going to add another regret to that list. What followed was a conversation that shattered normal royal protocol into pieces. Anne didn't ask William for permission to intervene or suggest that they form a committee to study the best approach. She gave him clear, direct guidance. She told him that Louis needed to get out, completely out of the palaces, away from the routines, removed from the suffocating expectations that were destroying his sense of self. Under Anne's watchful supervision, Louis was quietly moved to an environment that couldn't have been more different from palace life. He wasn't taken to a hospital or a therapist's office for intensive treatment. Instead, he was brought to a space where royal titles meant absolutely nothing, and where responsibilities were real but manageable. His days began with structure, but not the kind designed to create the perfect image for public consumption. This was a structure built around genuine purpose. Louis found himself feeding animals, walking outdoors in all kinds of weather, completing simple chores that had nothing to do with ceremony or appearances. These weren't tasks assigned as punishment or therapy exercises. They were simply the normal rhythms of a life lived outside the bubble of royalty. Anne had stripped away everything the world expected of Louis and replaced it with something the royal family had largely forgotten how to provide: freedom that existed without spectacle or observation. Princess Anne knew exactly what she was doing, and her approach was informed by painful personal experience. She had watched Princess Diana's increasingly desperate cries for help get buried under layers of tradition and institutional resistance. She had seen Prince Harry eventually rebel against the entire system, unable to find a way to exist within it healthily. She had watched William internalize everything, learning to hide his struggles behind a mask of duty and composure. Anne had decided years ago that if she ever saw this pattern developing again, if she ever recognized the early signs of someone being crushed by the institution, she would intervene regardless of protocol or consequences. With Louis, she was keeping that promise to herself. She wasn't going to watch another young person be destroyed by a system that valued image over well-being. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, something began to shift in Louis. The changes weren't dramatic or sudden, nothing that could be captured in a single breakthrough moment suitable for public relations. But there were small, vital signs that something inside him was beginning to reawaken. He started speaking more frequently and with more genuine emotion. He ate meals with increasing ease, no longer picking at food as though it were just another obligation. His eyes, which had been heavy and distant for so long, began to focus again on the world around him. He started asking questions about things that interested him, not because he felt he should show interest, but because genuine curiosity was returning. He smiled occasionally, and these smiles were different from the ones he had produced for cameras and public events. These smiles came from within, unprompted and unperformed, just natural responses to moments that pleased him. Anne kept all of this carefully away from public view. There were no photographs leaked to sympathetic media, no updates provided to royal correspondents. But to Anne, roles and titles had always mattered less than actual responsibility. And in this case, her responsibility was crystal clear. She needed to protect Louis, not the institution's image or the carefully constructed narrative of royal family life. She was protecting a child, and that took absolute precedence over everything else. Yet even as Louis began this slow process of rebuilding himself, troubling developments were occurring within the palace walls. Not everyone was pleased with Anne's quiet defiance of normal procedures. Some viewed her intervention as an implicit criticism of how the situation had been handled previously. Others worried about the precedent being set. In protecting the child, Anne had also inadvertently exposed fundamental problems within the system itself. She had demonstrated that sometimes the institution's carefully developed procedures were inadequate when dealing with genuine human suffering. And just as hope was starting to emerge from what had been an overwhelmingly dark period, a confidential document began circulating that would create an entirely new crisis and fundamentally change William's understanding of the institution he would one day lead.